So I'm going to share a painting for you and just say a few words. So this painting will hopefully allow me to elaborate some of the ideas that, or clarify some of the ideas Tanya has introduced. So this was painted in 1999 and it's titled Invasion. It hangs in the Museum of Sydney on prominent display. And its title points to the arrival of the First Fleet in Sydney Harbour, which launched more than 2 centuries of violence and displacement against Australia's Indigenous people. It shows the perspective of Indigenous Australians viewing this, this invasion with the gorgeous blues of the landscape kind of against the eerily skeletal faces of the redcoat soldiers. Siren writes about this painting, quote, "I wanted to make the Aboriginal people in control of the land, and when the ships arrived, the Aboriginal people were along the shoreline, and they told the British to go away. Terra nullius was used as a valid reason to claim Australia, and I dispute that claim, using this painting as proof." In writing this and in making this claim, Siren participates in a larger phenomenon of Indigenous Australian artists, as Jennifer Biddle has argued in her 2016 book, Remote Avant-Garde, Aboriginal Art Under Occupation. She writes that Indigenous Australian art, quote, "inaugurates prior rights and pre-existent claims of Indigenous First Nation peoples and territories." So just very quickly, we see Siren's work as recombinatory, as a recombinatory project, insofar as it takes advantage of recognizable visual art techniques, techniques that are notably not drawn from Indigenous aesthetic practices. And it does so to resist colonial power structures. Moreover, it asserts a collectivity, both in its representation of Indigenous community and its implied audience, which is called to resistance through Siren's critical framing. Our work finds resonant acts of resistance in Indigenous and colonized writing through the 19th century, and we look specifically to how Indigenous and colonized writers use genre and medium in recombinatory fashions to disidentify, to critique, and to resist. So that's all for now.
I guess that means that it's me next. I'm just also organizing the screens on my laptop. And also, I'm sorry about the lighting situation where I am. I recently moved house, so I haven't quite found my Zoom spot yet. But I'm Fariha Shaikh. I am a lecturer in Victorian literature at the University of Birmingham. Many thanks to David and Michael and Lara for organizing such a wonderful conference and asking me to be part of it, and to Ryan for organizing and kind of chairing this roundtable. My book came out in 2018. It's called 19th Century Settler Emigration in British Literature and Art. And part of the effort of this book was twofold. The first, to recognize that settler emigration transformed the literary marketplace and gave rise to a whole new range of literatures that we would now consider ephemera, such as emigration guidebooks, emigrant letters, and emigrant periodicals. The other thing that the book sought to do was to seek to understand how immigration literature such as this transformed what we see as canonical texts. So rather than seeing the literary canon as untouched by the processes of empire and settler colonialism, it sought to reframe them and indicate the ways in which they are shaped and transformed by settler colonialism. In the work that I've done subsequent to it coming out, I've consolidated kind of my own thinking about questions of race and placing them at the fore of settler colonial and empire studies more broadly. My next project actually isn't a settler colonial project, but it would fall under empire studies. It's provisionally entitled Opium Fictions from Thomas de Quincey to Amitav Ghosh. And in it, I'm shaping up a kind of conversation between opium and 19th century literature. So current studies on opium and literature of the long 19th century tend to focus on canonical authors and texts, such as Thomas de Quincey's Confessions of an Opium Eater, Coleridge's kind of poems, Wilkie Collins's The Moonstone, and Charles Dickens' Edwin Drood, for example. And the studies tend to focus on opiate-induced dreams or visions and the effect of opium on literary creativity. Although they will sometimes draw attention to the deep-seated anxieties about racial others in this work. What I'm hoping to do in this project is shift our readings of these literary texts so that we can foreground the fact that opium is a key major colonial commodity that is crucial to the existence of the East India Company and indeed to the expansion of the British Empire during this era. And so my project argues for a reconceptualization of the Victorian opium imagination so that in ways that foreground the histories of commodity frontiers, the violence of the commodity exchange, and a reappraisal of the literary geographies of opium.
Great. So we'll just go ahead and dive into our first question here. And the first question is, as we seek to deepen the relationship between 19th century British studies, and especially given the makeup of this panel, especially of the literary variety, with settler colonial studies, empire studies, and indigenous studies, how might these engagements not just add texts for us to study in the course of our work, but really transform our work? How might it transform who we read, what we value, and how we define the literary? So anyone can get started on that one. Go ahead, Fariha.
I don't mind kicking off. Sorry, every single time I click on the thing, my screens can rearrange. Okay, so that's a really, really interesting question. Thank you for raising it. I'm going to take work in the broadest possible sense to kind of include our research as well as our pedagogy, because I think if this year has shown, it's impossible to talk about one without the other, particularly when it comes to questions like this. And it's a question that I grappled with again and again when writing the book. And I think one of the things that quite often happens when you're looking at literatures that are produced out of empire is that of necessity you're looking outside of the canon. You're not looking at canonical kind of texts. And you're not looking at canonical genres either. So many of the genres that I was looking at, such as emigrants' letters and collections and anthologies of them and manuscript shipboard periodicals, they aren't considered canonical genres, let alone texts. And so it leads to kind of one feeling displaced, or should I say misplaced, until you find your group of scholars who share similar concerns and who kind of get what you're doing. And I can talk a little bit more kind of later, once everyone else has had a chance to speak, about the feeling of being at home within your research. But I think it was important for me to be able to place the canonical novels that I was looking at Elizabeth Gaskell and Charles Dickens in the book, alongside texts, these other texts, in order to be able to demonstrate how the form of the novel was shaped by the processes of settler colonialism. So yeah, that's what my kind of initial thoughts would be.
So there was as I was thinking about this question, there was a quotation from Carolyn Levine writing on orature and world literature that actually I think speaks to Fariha's points a little bit. She writes, "Since the great unwritten both travels to distant sights and gestures to the vast majority of the world's peoples, orature might even be imagined at the center rather than at the margins of world literature as an enterprise." And she argues that we need to attend to what she calls scenes of transcription, those moments of encounter that in which you see the text being produced as a written object, which I don't know if that's, I don't know, because Levine is thinking through a sort of specific set of problems in that piece around the category of world literature and the problem of anthologization. She's sort of limited to thinking about this kinds of solutions to the problem which she's identifying. But I think that problem at least is worth our hanging on to. Simply put, the written it can't be at the center of what we do, because it has historically, and especially in the 19th century, been reserved for an incredibly small number of peoples globally. And while we want to avoid a kind of fallacy that fetishizes the oral as you know, a sort of natural or kind of prior form of communication. I think it is important for us to do the kind of work that Fariha is talking about, where we expand the canon of genre drastically away from the literary as it's been historically conceived. And so I think for me, the tough thing to swallow is actually as literary scholars, we may be, our skills may be the least useful for approaching these kinds of questions. I think we can be sort of aids and helpers in various ways, but I think in particular, scholars working on issues of performance and orature are the ones we may want to be learning from and sort of centering in these conversations.
I can just follow up on that to say that just speaking from my work, I completely agree with what Manu said. In my work, the definition of the literary has shifted to include the sort of full range of forms encompassed within periodicals. And I've encountered some skepticism about this. So when I've presented on periodicals, my work on periodicals and censorship, and people have asked, well, what's literary about this? And so there's several ways to think about it in relation to the literary, if we must, which I don't think we have to, because our work this kind of work is necessarily so interdisciplinary. But insofar as it is, not only did much of the literature that produced in English in India appear in periodicals in the 19th and early 20th century, but in terms of censorship, I talk about how the way that all these periodicals, both in Indian languages and in English, were surveilled by the British government meant that they were using techniques of literary interpretation to sort of basically to incriminate them. Like, they were incriminated by the interpretation that such and such a piece of writing reflected disaffection in one way or the other, that it kind of contained this, even the sort of emotional intent, not even necessarily the language. So the use of the term disaffection made for a really sort of broad interpretive practice. So instead of being able to point to a sentence and say, this person is saying we must unseat the British government, you could point to a piece of writing and say, this sentence would ignite a kind of hatred or resentment against the government that's disloyal in its framing, or in its kind of in its affect, essentially. So I think that the focus on literary interpretation is important in terms of being able to read these periodicals and also understand how they were being read. And also just to sort of bring so many more texts, and to think about periodicals as a way to bring so many more texts and so many more writers and readers into the fold as we think about, you know, this kind of work across so many different methodologies and disciplines and orders.
Yeah, and I would build on that to say that, so my own experience has been being trained as a scholar of British literature. And then, so my first book is entirely on British texts. And then trying to expand into a more global framework, I started that project that became Imagined Homelands in 2008. And at the time, I can look back at it now and think about the ways that I was understanding that project and situating it. It was coming from that, from my training as a scholar of British literature. And I can look back now and see the limitations of that, in that it very much unwittingly does the work of centering whiteness, right, in the ways that the recent LARB piece is criticizing. And I think the challenge for those of us who are trained within that tradition is is to understand the necessity of leaving that behind in many ways, and finding other centers from which to situate our inquiry. Yeah, so that's really what, I mean, in some ways the shift from my first project to the second, which was from Britain to a more global thought, was easy compared to the shift that I'm imagining now from that global perspective that was largely centered around whiteness to one that is not. And I think that it's that much more difficult shift that that I'm most excited about for where the field more broadly might be heading, because I think that's where some really exciting work is to be done.
Yeah, I think so too. I don't know if the people participating in this conversation know. So Jason and I both wrote books on colonial poetry that came out within like 2 months of each other. And I always call Brown Romantics the dumb version of Imagined Homelands. But it was the same experience where I took with me all the sort of background coming out of being a scholar primarily of the literary. And it's interesting though, as and that project draws heavily on on periodical poetry, and so sort of getting back to what Tanya was starting to suggest about the democratizing potential of periodical, and also the way that the periodical becomes the site of resistance. What I've been exploring lately in the context of British Guyana is that whole field of contestation in British Guyana between white settler and Afro-Creole native plays out in sort of the periodical sphere at the expense, sort of primarily even as a means of excluding the multiple sort of indigenous peoples of British Guyana from not only the conversation, but by extension, from the very concept of the human, which over the course of the 19th century, again, I said this earlier, is thoroughly bound up with can you read and can you write, right? And that's complicated. It's complicated in various ways, not least because that's bound up with Christian missionary education, and so it's bound up with religion. But one of the things that I see happening in this current work that I'm doing is that I now have to go back and think about all the things that I sort of assumed were sort of potentially liberatory or dynamic about a periodical sort of culture, and start to reframe them in terms of what they're saying about who is a rightful participant in the Republic of Letters.
Yeah, what strikes me across all of these comments is that there's this kind of recursive dynamic that happens, right? So that there's we want to study other places besides Britain, or get a handle on understanding other sites and other communities within the broad rubric of the British Empire. And then that takes us to other kinds of materials. I mean, I think Fariha, the way you talked about genres, it's like, well, like they're not, we can't find the novel, right? We can't find the kind of poetry that we might expect. We might not be able to find it. It's like, and we have to, and then it's like, you have to engage in periodicals. You have to look at these other things. And then as we grapple, especially, I think, Manu, you're bringing this up really powerfully, the question of indigenous populations who have different forms of literacy that aren't based in print, that aren't based on alphabetic text, then all of a sudden we have to go other places as well, right? Or kind of, it's like, and develop new methods and go to fields like indigenous book history, which is not centered on the codex always, which takes us another place, looking at other fields like folklore and anthropology, and like how do they deal with these, and they have their own problems too. But the ways in which it's like our traditional methods of reading are requiring us to start to develop these different conversations, particularly with Indigenous studies and the frameworks that they've developed. So.
But I recognize, Tanya, what you were saying about kind of people coming up to you and saying, but that's not literary, kind of, because that is something that happens again and again, both with the Settler Immigration Project and also with the Opium Project. And it's a real kind of double bind, because the question of kind of literary, the question of genre within literature is a real question of the canon and kind of resisting it. And I'm reminded of Susan Ziegler's book, Inventing the Addict, in which she says that kind of this kind of body of kind of criticism that focuses on De Quincey and Coleridge and other late Romantic Victorian writers kind of, I think she uses the word something like valorizes their experiences as ones that are given in a universal language, experiences that are taken to kind of speak for all. And that disguises their social privilege and cultural authority as literary geniuses. And so I think kind of one of the things for me in developing this second project has been kind of moving away from those kind of canonical figures, but then also trying to come up with a critical vocabulary and a critical language and a methodological framing of the different kinds of genres and texts that I'm looking at quite frequently that kind of, as has been mentioned, happens in periodicals.
Muted.
I think this, got it. So I think this takes us to, you know, our next question that we talked a little bit about, which is what is the utility, if any, of retaining temporal categories like Victorian studies, Romanticism, even 19th century studies? And as you all are engaging in this work and your research, what investments do you have in them still, if any, and why?
Am I the only romanticist in the group? All right. Then, let me look at my notes. I stopped to think about it. Oh, okay. So actually, in the question, as we talked about it, as you sent it out before, it was retaining categories like Victorian and Romanticism,
That's right.
not temporal. And the only reason I raised that is because I've never cared about Romanticism as a temporal category. For me, what matters is that it's a particular kind of ideological category, whereby a diversity is imagined to be transcendable. So the Romantic movement, for me, which is not sort of rooted specifically in the early 19th century, has to do with materially a rise in diverse reading audiences that creates the belief that the artist, and in particular the poet, has the capacity to transcend differences. It's the sort of birth of a kind of new universalism. And that for me is worth retaining only insofar as it continues to be useful for understanding the challenges we continue to face as we think about sort of world literatures and diverse literatures, indigenous literatures and non-literatures, the ways in which we continue to sort of cling to a romantic belief that there's a sort of that the text is for all of us, and so that's why I hang on to the idea that I am a romanticist, because that is the problem that I'm interested in thinking about.
Can I come in on that? Because the kind of answer that I've drafted actually picks up on exactly where you ended, Manu. And it was, I have no problem with kind of identifying as a Victorianist, but I've noticed more and more that kind of it always does come with the addition of, but I'm a post-colonial Victorianist, or I'm a Victorianist interested in empire. And so I guess the fact that I feel that I have to continually modify and adjust what kind of Victorianist I am itself shows kind of the preconceived notions of the label, of it, the preconceived notions that Victorian studies as a label carries. And I think it's useful, as Manu says, that a revived understanding of what Victorian studies or what Romanticism is kind of like, I guess, kind of the project that all four of us on this kind of panel are interested in. Yeah, sorry, I'm just reading the chat now. Someone else can take over.
Oh, I can just say, as also a Victorianist, I guess I could be called a Victorianist that works on empire studies, but I really have come to disidentify with the category of Victorianist, and both the categories really, although I take Manu's point about the kind of problem that these formulations can embody. But yeah, it's not useful to me because, you know, for all the ways that it's restrictive, and especially in terms of the sort of transnational work that I'm doing now with Jason, there is ways in which we're talking about a number of different contexts. We're moving across different borders, we're moving across time periods, and we're thinking about conversations and conflicts, and you literally can't see those taking shape if you restrict yourself either to a specific concept of a period that ends with the death of Victoria, say, or even like the end of the 19th century, or with, you know, a particular canon that's constructed within the field of Victorian studies. So I think it's been important to me to sort of completely do away with the concept of Victorian, both in terms of the way I talk about the field to my students and in terms of my own work and what I've been able to work on, because I don't think within that frame.
Yeah, and I'm very much on the page with that, but I'll say additionally, I think it's part of this work of decentering that has to occur. Manu, I take everything you said to heart. I think Romanticism might resonate a bit differently because it's not something that's focused on a monarch, right? And it's not necessarily limited to a nation. We can talk about a kind of romanticism that is, you know, in various ways global, or but that Victorian as a term has such a different resonance, and I think it works against exactly what we're trying to do moving forward.
Yeah, I'm thinking about that as Tanya was talking, and Fariha was talking too. I wonder though if the term Victorian is useful for a parallel reason, because it does index a specific imperial ideology that actually exceeds but is symbolized by the crown and the monarch. So I wonder if, you know, it's a kind of if there's a critique from within the term of Victorian that's worth continuing to launch until you're no longer qualifying Victorian as post-colonial Victorian, and everyone else is actually having to qualify theirs as, but I'm not doing the empire. I'm limited to England between these years. It's probably naively idealistic, but you know, there's this this moment in that movie Office Space where the one of the main characters' name is Michael Bolton, which is the same as a singer from the 1980s. And Michael Bolton, everyone says, why don't you go by Mike? And he says, well, why should I change my name? Because he's the one that sucks. And I wonder if, well, why should you guys abandon Victorian studies if the problem is with the other Victorianists, the ones who aren't doing this kind of quote unquote decolonizing work? Anyhow, I'll shut up with that.
I think that's what I was getting at as well. So kind of, Jason, you spoke about the LRB piece, the Undisciplining Victorian Studies piece that came out over the summer. And I think their collective call for the need to kind of critically engage and dismantle the ways in which notions of whiteness can structure the field was very compelling. So kind of, if I did want a version of Victorian studies, and it would be a version of Victorian studies that critiques its own Eurocentricity and that demonstrates a greater appreciation of the legacies of empire and of 19th century colonialism. And also, I guess, a version of Victorian studies that interrogates how we're living through the aftermath and the legacies of colonialism to this present day as well, and that kind of takes that into account.
Absolutely. And I think, yeah, I mean, I think it's this whole conversation is I hadn't anticipated that the resonances of what Romanticism does as a category versus what Victorianism does as a category, and the baggage that comes along with it, and also the affordances of those different kinds of terms. And I think for myself, you know, Tanya, you have this kind of disidentificatory relationship, or maybe just rejectionist model. And I think for me, I have a kind of perverse attachment that might be more of the Michael Bolton kind, where it's just kind of like I'm stubbornly going to continue to articulate this as a term and make it mean what I want it to mean. And I think that once, especially when you put it into context of in conversation with Indigenous studies, you know, different frameworks of time collide. So what happens when you have Indigenous frameworks of time, which are very, very different than, and you know, the 19th century isn't even the 19th according to this, what is a century, and then putting that into context of Victorian as a category. I kind of like those juxtapositions and the dissonances created by that. But did anybody else have final comments about this question before we shifted?
Well, I was just going to say that what's useful about your stubbornness, Ryan, I think, is that it means that, I mean, and this relates to what Manu was saying as well, that if you hold on to Victorian in some way, or at least you continue to engage with the field as I do, then you're able to sort of bring these new conversations that have emerged from the field and grown into different directions back and reshape it. So if you care about the fact that it exists in its current form and you want it to change, you actually have to continue to speak to it, and you have to continue to publish in journals called Victorian Studies, for example. It really is a disidentification, because you're kind of, if you care, you're still inside it, even as you're kind of outside it, kind of trying to pull it somewhere else.
Great. So anybody want to add a comment to that? Chime in? Okay. So one of the themes that's kind of emerged over the last couple of days is really this question about ethical challenges of working with Indigenous and non-British communities and non-white communities and texts. And so do you have anything that you kind of want to add to that conversation that's have been emerging, especially as scholars who were trained as Victorianists or Romanticists in various forms?
My model for so many things is Nikki Hessel, who I just admire as a human being, as well as a scholar. And she's also one of the few people I know who can sort of marry those two things into a coherent identity, which is to say her work engages, I mean, she works with translators, Indigenous peoples, but she never mistakes her scholarly work for her activism on the ground. There is a particular, I mean, that's an aspiration for me. And she's not the only one. I think of the ways that, you know, someone closer to my original field of training, post-colonial studies, the way that Gayatri Spivak, you know, goes to India, goes to rural China, rural India, right? And works with people. And I think it's just important for me to have as a North Star, that sense that we don't mistake the very important work we do as scholars for on-the-ground activism, which demands a significant part of our time and attention. This came up for me. I was in Guyana working on 19th century periodicals and the Black press in particular. And I was talking to a local activist, and he was saying, you know, so you're working on this poet who published in these periodicals. Have you gone out and talked to people who are writing poetry now? And it just hadn't occurred to me, right? That like living poets, people working through problems of colonization, were actually necessary to my sort of thinking fully about the place of colonial poetry in the 19th century. So what, you know, in what ways are those fights sort of alive, and have they transformed now, and what can I do, not specifically through my writing, which is still aimed at a relatively small audience, but through my acts of solidarity and my physical presence and my community building.
Yeah, I could add or continue in that line of thought by saying that so much of my thinking about the 19th century with respect to Indigenous studies has come through my engagements with Gordon Siren and with Indigenous scholars in Australia and activists, social workers. For more than a decade, I've been teaching in Australia for short-term programs, and one of the most meaningful work that I do in that is put my students in conversation with Indigenous scholars and activists in Australia, and that puts me in the position of being a student as well, and that's it's been extraordinarily just moving and inspiring, and I think it's essential to do that kind of work if we want to then try to inhabit some kind of 19th century space that's engaging with indigeneity.
Just because you brought up teaching, Jason, I've been reading Carolyn Vitensky's, I think it's called the article, Casual Racism in Victorian Literature. And she talks very compellingly of, the first time that kind of a racial slur is mentioned within a Victorian novel that she's reading, such as Rudyard Kipling's Kim or Wilkie Collins's Moonstone, or even a novel that is not directly related to empire. And she says that the first time that a racial comment comes up in class pick up on it and there's a conversation about it. And then the second time that it happens, the class refer to the first conversation. The third time, they look at each other, they shake their heads. And then the fourth time, it doesn't even get a mention or a response. And it's a really interesting article for those of you that haven't read it and she's kind of critiquing, she realizes that she's doing this and she's critiquing the way in which the students kind of, not the students, but her methods of teaching kind of cause the students to become inured to casual racism within Victorian literature. And it's a really interesting article for kind of how it talks about how we might secure a deeper and more sustained critical engagement with the casual racism of Victorian literature, that asks students to kind of engage with these moments through what she uses the V21 Collective's kind of phrase strategic presentism, which is a renegotiated relationship with the past that reframes our relationship with the present. And I think more and more kind of that is the ethical problem or the ethical kind of challenge that I would see as my work over the next kind of coming year, I guess, and kind of moving forward beyond that as well, as being that my research kind of is attempting to take into, to destabilize and kind of question the Eurocentric claims of the texts and genres that I'm looking at, but taking that to my teaching, I think, is a form of activism that I would kind of, that I'm deeply invested in as of the 14th, because that's when term starts.
Tanya, did you want to add anything to the? Oh, you're muted still. Sorry.
Okay. I guess there's two things I think about in relation to the question of ethics, the ethics of this kind of work. And one of them is a sort of to think about a politics of citation, where I think it's so important when you're moving across different fields and across different national traditions, that you're responsible to the work that's already been done in those spaces. I think people are intimidated by the amount of work or sometimes by the otherness of work, the different languages, the different kind of framing that takes place in different spaces. So when I started working closely on censorship of the press in India, all of a sudden I was like, well, now I have to teach myself South Asian studies, but you do have to do that work. And I just think that's really important for people to always bear in mind, because I think it's, as this becomes a more common form of framing projects, we just don't want to sort of shortchange the work that's already being done by trying to do it all too quickly, too facilely. So that's one thing that's important. And the other thing, I just agree with Fariha that one of the main ways I think about the ethics of this work is in relation to my teaching and how I'm framing it for my students.
Yeah, and it just strikes me, you know, kind of thinking across all of your comments. I mean, I think citational politics, I think, are something that we all need to think very carefully about. Responsibilities to fields that have already done this work. You know, I think in my own work, I think that not only means deliberately citing particular folks, especially Indigenous scholars, but also de-emphasizing and decentering the must the must cite things within our field, right? Because that generates a particular kind of energy that if we're going to talk about periodical culture in the 19th century, we must cite X, Y, and Z and go through a discussion, right? And I think that those things are who do we center and who do we actually might have to decenter, not by ignoring their contributions, but maybe they go in a footnote, right? And when typically that's reversed. And it also strikes me too, relating that to Manu, your comment about kind of commitments. And I think, you know, Nikki Hessel for me is also a deep source of inspiration in the way that she's worked with collaboration. But I think especially in literary studies, you know, the ways that a lot of decolonial methodologies have come out of the social sciences and that our work looks different. And that I think we need to be mindful of not going to, and I'm not saying Hessel does this at all, because I want to be very clear about that, but going to communities and then doing a kind of Victorian anthropological thing of teach me these things so that I can then go take this back in my knowledge and then write it as under my, you know, and I think and I don't think she does that at all, but I think that's really important, right? And so it's what fixes or what addresses that for her is her own political commitments on the ground, right? It's not just, oh, I need to learn something about Maori, and so I'm just gonna like find this collaborator and then extract this information, but I'm going to be in relation, right?
Yeah.
And in a deep relation.
I think that being in relation, it's also being in a specific kind of relation where I feel like the for me the language, the ethical language coming out of someone like Levinas is helpful, where the sort of, if there were a categorical imperative there, it would be to preserve the alterity of the other, right? Because what happens too frequently is we repeat a kind of colonial practice of extracting, I mean, just exactly what you're talking about, of extracting knowledge. And it's hard to generalize about it. In the same way, it's sort of, I think, hard to generalize or extrapolate from that sort of, from what Levinas is proposing, because it's continually situational, right? The ethical imperative is not from above. It emerges at the point of contact. It emerges at the point of contact with the text, with the other person, right? And we're continually called anew to preserve the alterity of that other person, to never reduce that other thing to a function of the self. So I think in the same way that I've seen, you know, and Nikki describes herself as a settler scholar, and she is. So the same way I sort of draw inspiration from what I've seen her do in practice. I think there are, you know, there's a whole wealth of ethical theory that we can sort of also use to frame our relationship to the way we practice literary criticism, especially when we're working with Indigenous texts and questions of indigeneity. Great.
Excellent. So just kind of wrapping up with our final question and kind of closing before we open up to the whole group. So what does it mean to be asking these questions and undertaking this work in the context of 2020 and the multiple crises that we're facing as a global community? And how does that play out in our daily lives as scholars, as teachers, as people working in our home institutions and our communities? Or maybe we just want to step away from that question. Well, and 2020 in general.
what this conversation just recently was making me think about is how so much of my work recently has been centered around conversations with people in Australia, and I've been trying to do that from a distance via, you know, different technologies, and what's been striking to me over and over again is how it doesn't actually work very well for these particular relationships that I'm trying to build. I think being in person where you can truly kind of be present fully it's just not possible through the medium of, at least for me, it just hasn't worked through the medium of the computer. So I am so eager to get beyond this moment and to get back to, you know, being able to engage more fully with the communities that I'm working with. Yeah.
2020.
I'll just say one thing about sort of teaching in 2020 is that I think it kind of does its own work in terms of making these connections between past and present, which you sometimes have to make for your students. You know, there's always the danger when you work on the 19th century and you're talking about racism, for example, that you're locating it in the past and elsewhere, especially if you're teaching in the US and you're talking about Victorian Britain, say. And there's a way in which, you know, it can be a comfortable thing for students to talk about racism that's located, you know, elsewhere in time and space. But in this moment, no students are imagining it as being elsewhere in any form whatsoever. So they're doing all the work of bringing it into the present constantly. And that's very gratifying.
I have thoughts, but also, Fariha, it was partly, I think, out of our earlier conversations. I think you were, this was a question that you had wanted to make sure you spoke, that you raised, actually, right? So do you want to
it was just
jump
a
in
suggestion.
before?
If you've got something to say, you can say it, man.
I
mean, I'm happy to kind of, yeah, say my thoughts.
Yeah, please.
Okay. Well, 2020 has been a hellhole. And kind of thinking through the ways in which the pandemic has exacerbated kind of existing inequalities, thinking through the Black Lives Matter kind of movements and all of these different things, and the demands that our home institutions are making on our time as well, and just kind of my main reason for kind of putting this question in there, I think, was to remind ourselves that research is kind of very material and that we are working within kind of materially grounded practices. And I'm reading Nicole Shippen's, her book called Decolonizing Time, Decolonizing Time, Work, Leisure and Freedom, which was published in 2014 by Paul Grave. But she talks about kind of clawing back time, both kind of from the tendrils of capitalism, but also institutional time as well. And I just want to kind of send a message out to people as term starts, as a kind of gesture to kind of towards hope, which, because we all know that this term is going to be pretty hectic. But the other thing that I wanted to say was, in the context of 2020 and the Black Lives Matter movement, which Tanya, you were talking about, was the, I mean, I don't know how it was for people at other institutions, but certainly kind of at Birmingham, there was this kind of rush of a conversation to increase diversity on courses in preparation for the coming year. I was struck by the language that some people were using kind of when they talked about it. They talked about being radicalized because they were putting authors of color on their courses. And I was startled by this because it's something that I and my colleagues of color have always done, and kind of other colleagues have always done. And so this should have been the norm and not a radical moment, and it shouldn't have taken police violence and mass protests to realize this is a basic issue of racial justice within higher education. But it also meant that I kind of suddenly felt at home, because people were now welcoming suggestions of authors of colour, such as Sarojini Naidu and Guru Dutt or Mukhraj Anand, to be put on courses, rather than seeing them as authors be pigeonholed kind of into the week on race. But those are my comments, like both a recognition that we're working in very constrained circumstances, and a kind of increased awareness of how we position ourselves, both in relation to our teaching and our research. And also, I was saying this to Sarah Cummin, who I think is a participant here, but if anyone is on Instagram, they should follow the NAP Ministry, because I think it's really, really good for finding kind of solace in 2020.
I think the thing that I think the thing that's become really clear to me is that there's no time for incrementalism anymore. You know, there's this meme on Twitter where people say, "What radicalized you?" And some people take it seriously, and some people joke about it. But I feel like if 2020 hasn't radicalized you, it's never going to happen, right? If the exacerbation of, it's not even racial tension, right, of anti-Blackness, and all its reverberations across every sector of living and globally, if this newest in a long series of flare-ups isn't going to sort of push us to make changes now, it's never going to happen. I mean, and I am heartened. My moment of hope in all this is that I have seen a new conception of solidarity emerging, where you get Indigenous peoples for Black lives, where you get, in my case, the Desis for Black lives, where we get new understandings of solidarity that aren't primarily self-interested, but are other interested towards a sort of broader human interest or even anti-human interest. That's my sort of, that's my takeaway from 2020, is that it's now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. And I'll just add, as we kind of pivot to opening up to the questions from the group and everyone, that it strikes me that doing this as a virtual conference, if this were in person when it was supposed to happen, I wouldn't have been. I know I wouldn't have been in person there, even though theoretically I could have been in a way that I cannot be now. But ironically, because it's virtual, I can be here, and I don't think this conversation would be happening if it were not for what's emerged. And so, yeah, these different kinds of affordances and possibilities, even as, like so many of you, I'm longing to get back to a different mode of being. Without getting back to a different mode of being that then is a return to the normal, right? And so, I mean, 2020 is bringing up all of these urgent crises and intersecting crises. And so, yeah, I'm glad to be in community and thinking about this and working through it with all of you. So with that, I see a vigorous discussion happening in the chat around citation. I don't know if anybody wants to bring that into the verbal conversation here, or if other folks want to put in a question.
Yeah, since I seem to have produced a bit of controversy by just kind of echoing Tanya's sense that really that, you know, a citational practice that's based in identity politics, we need to cite more BIPOC people, we need to cite more women. Of course we do, but it's not a substitute for doing the real hard graft of getting to know about scholarship and about fields of scholarship that are going on elsewhere outside of the Euro-American Academy. Now, it's not an either-or thing, but I think sometimes in these conversations, a decolonial citational practice is seen as citing more BIPOC and women scholars in the Euro-American Academy rather than doing the harder job of looking elsewhere.
I mean, the ends of an ethical citational practice are to change the forms of knowledge that we privilege, right? And so as long as that's what's driving us, rather than quota filling, then there's no real conflict between the two, right? And actually that sort of goes back to something that, you know, that came up at the beginning of this conversation, which is, I mean, I've been thinking a lot about the privileging of the written, but more generally, that is the same question or an analogous question at least, that's motivated the Cite Black Women movement, for example, right? It's that there are forms of knowledge coming from embodied knowledge specifically that are systemically and systematically and historically and continually not just marginalized, but thoroughly excluded from our ways of understanding the world. So much so that something that Ryan raised earlier, right, is something that I don't have we really reckoned with alternative conceptions of time in 19th century studies, right? I mean, it's the kind of thing you can see getting sort of eye rolls, right? Or just out of hand dismissals in most of our professional organizations. So yeah, I mean, that's my 2 cents. It's probably spent more than 2 cents on it. And just want to apologize for generally being a talkative person. I'll step back for a little while.
It strikes me too to think that the question of identity and knowledge production, right, is so overdetermined within the academy, right? So that scholars of color are also produced in very particular ways in the academy generally, but also I think especially in 19th century literary studies. And so I think it's no accident that it's like the usual suspects are not rounded up, but round themselves up and get together at conferences, right, when we could do things and talk to one another, and that these are then the folks that are then produced in various kinds of ways as native informants for the field. And I mean, and this goes back to your point about Tanya's point about disidentification. I mean, it's like I both like acknowledge what it means that I'm distinctly aware of being a non-white person in a white-dominated field, and that gives me a particular relation to the field. But then it's also like, well, like, why do we have to keep doing this work, right? And so, I mean, I think it's not just about knowledge in this pure sense. It's not just about identity in this pure sense, but all of those things are combining in various ways. And Manu, I just really take your point. Like, what is the end game here? It's about transforming systems of knowledge that organize our field. And that's what we have to stay focused on. And that's going to involve citing more folks with particular identities, but also not adhering just to that principle either. So I don't know if other folks want to, I'm a big talker too, so I'll step back as well if other folks want to chime in.
I'm also kind of wary of this notion that kind of citing BAME or BIPOC scholars. I'm kind of wary of a notion of framing that as citing kind of BAME or BIPOC scholars as kind of easy work, as opposed to reading critical work from the global south. I'm just kind of very uneasy with that distinction. And I agree, I don't think that they're mutually exclusive either.
I agree with everything that's been said. I was just thinking, I was trying, like, kind of puzzling over the resistance that I continue to feel not at this conference, but at many others that I go to, in part the question about literary value, but many other questions. And I think part of what is fueling it is a kind of anxiety about the discipline itself, which, you know, has been established over so many decades, and this fear of, well, you know, if we lose that centering on Victorian studies, then what, right? And I think, you know, increasingly the answer has to be, well, then there's something really exciting that's going to be happening. And, you know, where are those jobs in Victorian studies anyways, right? I don't really see them. So, you know, I think it's a real misconception if we have this fantasy that the jobs are going to return, that the field will just be allowed to continue doing as what it's always done. I just don't see that that's what it is. I think, and I think there are good reasons for that. So, you know, the kind of work that I've heard over the last 2 days is offering a very different possible future for 19th century studies. And I think that that's, you know, that's something to embrace and be excited about.
Great.
And can I just say, Manu, what you said, Manu, about this, you said new forms of solidarity that are other interested. It's just one of the most beautiful things I've heard in a while. So thank you for that.
Yes, I share my appreciation for that. So Holly, you wanted to jump in here.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Yeah, I just want to say really quickly that this is an incredible discussion that really needs to be made more prominent, and this whole conversation is legitimizing a serious frustration of mine that I've had throughout my experience, in the idea that, like, the canon, like the literary canon, you know, in the context of English literature I'm speaking from, obviously, is one of the first things you're taught, and you're taught about its importance, but in my experience, we were never taught to reject that. I actually remember I was marked down on an essay once because, not badly, but enough to annoy me, because the comment was, you can't talk about this topic without citing, I can't remember which particular author, but it was a very big, typical white male author from the 1800s. And they're like, how have you spoken about this without using him to back up your point? I was like, well, the point was that I wasn't using him because everyone recites him. I want to talk about, I want to talk about it from the perspective of the other side, if you will, you know, the authors who have done amazing work on these topics but weren't recognized at the time because they weren't a white man, essentially. So yeah, I just think this is such an important conversation, and it's something that's frustrated me for years, how you're kind of veered towards talking about particular authors and particular canonical texts throughout kind of academia, and it shouldn't be like that. You should be encouraged to go outside the box, to think outside the box, to find more sources from more perspectives. And yeah, I just think this conversation is so valuable, and I just wanted to thank you all for bringing it up, because yeah, it's legitimized the frustration of mine, so thank you.
I don't know if anybody wanted to respond to that, or Doro, I think you were next up in the queue.
I'll respond in 3 seconds, I promise. I'll do it very quickly. I'm glad you raised that, Holly, not least because there's a long-standing and myth for the last 20 years that the canon wars are over, right? That we did that was the 90s, and let's move on, right? But one of the things you're reminding me is that, no, the canon wars, A, aren't over, and B, I think more broadly, they can't, because a canon is a war, right? It's a thing that is used to dominate and sort of invites our contestation.
I'll just say briefly one thing that has troubled me a lot in terms of the kind of the idea of the literary as the category that shapes our field, as well as the fields constituted within it, or rather that shapes our discipline, as well as the fields constituted within it. On the one hand, I don't have very much investment in, you know, a sort of restrictive approach to the literary and to periods at all. On the other hand, we're put in this position where if you're in an institution in which the humanities are being defunded, I mean, most of our institutions, if they're public, are being defunded right now, but in particular the humanities, there's a way in which you have to kind of fight for the value of the discipline that forces you into this kind of entrenched position where you're defending a discipline as constituted through these canons and within, these fields, because you want, for example, my department hasn't hired a new faculty member in the last 5 years after losing 10 faculty members. And when we do talk about a hire, which we'll probably never get, we have to be so strategic about thinking about field because we also have to make an argument for the value of that field as well as for the value of English in general. So it's just important to remember those structures that are shaping these conversations so that we're able to shape our responses as well at the same time as we're resisting the categories that we want to resist.
And it strikes me too, Tanya, as you talk, I mean, I think in some, especially in the different discussions that emerge from the LAR piece, just the national differences in this, and especially the way that what Victorian signifies in various ways, and in the US versus the UK, just to take, not to mention the other places that folks are coming from, and in Australia and elsewhere around the world. But I mean, I think it's like what the investment is in a particular period. I mean, it's like, and what the Victorian can look like, I think it looks very different, and the demands that were being placed through these systems and institutions and financial structures. So let's see, Doro, did you want to jump in with your question here or comment?
It's rather comment. Still on the canon wars, I'm sorry that I still have to stick to it, but I mean, like looking at what I experienced so far in my life, like for example, in German schools, I just recently read, there are no women authors taught at all. Like it starts in school, there are no women authors taught, only poetry, some poet authors like after Second World War are part of the canon. In the Netherlands, people are not educated about their colonial history, and that is a huge history. Like students don't know about it if they enter university. So that I, as a German scholar, started to teach Dutch students about their own proper colonial history. So there's so much work to be done. And actually, it's so difficult to bring these topics to the table that we need to be aware of that it's actually something that needs work to be put in. And it's, of course, citation is one thing, and one shouldn't take authors just because they come from a certain area or whatever, but it's nevertheless, I think it's really very important to keep that in mind, what we are up to, because to change knowledge systems that are in place because colonialism happened, because patriarchy happened, etc., we shouldn't forget that. I just wanted to say that I find it really important.
Anybody want to comment on that here? Okay, Michael, I think you're up.
Hello. Oh man, I'm very shadowy here, emerging from the depths. I really enjoyed this discussion a lot. I want to go back to some comments that were made for the very first question about the nature of the literary and the centrality of literary objects in cultural history or in literary studies, to put it rather paradoxically. And while I fully appreciate the arguments in favor of looking at non-literary sources, whether in the sense of less high art sort of sources like periodicals that don't fit into the dominant genre system, or non-written sources like orature, as Manu said, I guess the one thing that I would say to that is there are also very important literary traditions in the narrow and highly prestigious sense, which are really severely overlooked in Romantic and Victorian scholarship, at least in my knowledge of it. I mean, poor old Lara's probably going to roll her eyes in the background while I make these particular examples, but two I would raise are, for example, the Swahili manuscript tradition, which runs back to the 17th century at least, and is full of things like histories and devotional texts and epic poems and so on, which are in manuscript form, and I think would fit any definition of the literary. I'm not sure if they'd fit the definition of Indigenous, but and there are, you know, there's obviously considerable barriers to accessing things like that for particularly Anglophone scholars. But I just was wondering if any of you had thoughts on that, on maybe ways we could recover the concept of the literary in a way that would retain this push for a more global and open literary scholarship.
Yeah, I think there's an important place for the literary on the margins of of what we do, right? I don't have any problem with thinking. I mean, again, this is, I'm trained as a literature scholar, right? But the more I think about the ways in which a global literature, a field or as a methodology, the ways in which that has historically and continues to delegitimize other forms of knowledge production, needs to be, we need to sort of face that head on. But again, like, I see no problem with having literature in its sort of narrowest sense present at the edges of the discussion. It's one form of communication. It's one form of artistic expression. It's one form, right? It's actually multiple forms. But I'm struggling, I continue to struggle with its, the ways that it's come to occlude and therefore delegitimize other sort of kinds of, and again, I keep going back to this, I think I've said this phrase a couple of times, embodied knowledges, knowledges that can't be separated from the subjects that articulate them.
Yeah, and I mean, just to build on this and add some citations to ones that are coming in here. I mean, I think somebody already cited Daniel Heath Justice's work, Why Indigenous Literatures Matter. And I think that his discussion of just the category of literature itself, I think is a really, really useful one. And then for me in my own work, and it's kind of in the background of what I was doing in my paper earlier, is Lisa Brooks's The Common Pot, which is just an amazing book of text on Indigenous book history, and looking at Abenaki. She's an Abenaki scholar, and she's thinking about birch bark scrolls and these other like non-alphabetic communication technologies and the ways in which to kind of think about those as a book historian and literary scholar. And so, I mean, I think these are the models, right, which don't shun the literary, but think about it in a different constellation, and different kind of set of, are trying to rebuild a different set of values around it, rather than just implicitly valorizing one particular form of printed alphabetic text in particular genres, which I think is really what I hear Manu, what you're getting at. So, other folks here, I'm not sure that I see questions that were coming in. Any folks want to chime in?
I just had a thought in reference to the literary, that the question is particularly a question that emerges out of Victorian studies as it has been constituted, because when you think about 18th century studies, 18th century scholars don't work on literary texts as conventionally defined, right? They do some work on some of them, but a lot of the texts that we're working on are philosophical texts, and it's not a problem within the field. You know, it's not constituted as a sort of departure from, you know, some canonical notion of what you're supposed to learn about in 18th century studies. So it's interesting just to think about those field differences and why Victorian studies has connected to the literary in the way it has.
Great. Any final comments here that people want to make? Questions? Excellent. Well, I think we'll wrap up maybe just a little bit early from this conversation, but I just want to thank again the people on the panel here, my esteemed colleagues, and then also just a big round of applause to David, Laura, and Michael for just a really wonderful series of conversations and events. But Manu, I think I saw your hand raised as a comment.
You're muted, Manu.
There's one question in the chat. If we're wrapping up, that's totally fine, but maybe we can
We've got time for one more question.
Katie Peters.
Definitely.
Oh, sorry, I missed that, Katie. Katie Peters, are you there? Did you want to come and comment or just have me read?
Oh, can you please just ask the question in the chat? She says. So,
oh,
as someone,
okay. No, I'm missing. There we go. Yeah, go ahead, Manu. You read it.
Sorry, I will, and then I won't answer. So this will be my talking time. As someone who does not work in literary studies of the 18th or 19th century, it seems to me that scholars of literature, expansively defined, can offer methods, i.e. close reading, understanding of a text inscription, the influence of genre, which came up earlier, attention to narrative and narrativization, to the conversation on decolonial scholarship, bracketing debates on canonicity and the field's contours geographically and historically, if such a gesture is possible. What would the panelists say about method? I think it's a really good question, and I think it particularly invites Tanya and Jason to sort of talk about the recombinatory, which is, I think it's methodological, right? And it's one that derives from literary scholarship, but other forms of other fields as well.
Absolutely. So an example of the kind of work we're doing, I would point to Pauline Johnson, who Ryan was talking about earlier today. Tanya and I have been looking at some of her poems and the way that she is redeploying genres that would have been circulating at the moment in the late 19th century. So for example, the bush ballad that was popularized in Australia, and the kinds of ballad poetry that Kipling was publishing at the same time. Both the Kipling and the Australian poems are using the genre as a form of really of nationalism and more specifically white nationalism. And Johnson's work is really clearly inhabiting that space in order to resist it, right? So it's doing this political work that might not be immediately recognizable to us today because most of us are not thinking about the Australian bush ballad, for example. But if you return it to that historical moment, you can see Johnson doing this extraordinary politically resistant work. And anyway, so that would be an example of using the techniques of coming from literary scholarship to look at other kinds of literary production and to and to find different kinds of political resistance in them. Tanya, do you want to add to that?
The only thing I would add is that this is one of the values of collaboration, is that even within literary studies, right, I wouldn't recognize the form of the bush ballad, and Jason would, because he's done work on Australian literature and because he's grounded in a study of British poetry. He can also understand the form through those more traditional lenses, as well as these different traditions that are using the ballad. So, and I wouldn't be able to see those things. So it just shows how deeply we're drawing on literary training that doesn't even kind of span our two forms of knowledge from within the same field, right? We're both we were both shaped as Victorianists, and we work closely together, and yet our knowledge base is quite distinct, and that's why it's great to be able to talk to each other.
Mm-hmm. Fariha, did you want to add anything? No pressure though.
No, I think I'm fine. We're near the end, okay. So yeah.
Okay, great. I'll just say, as my own sense too, is also backing away from certain kinds of methods has been, or kind of changing tack. So specifically around close reading and the issues of language and translation. I think one of the things that I've confronted in my own research on these topics is my own really distinct lack of skill in learning new languages, and the problems that that poses, that I will never be able to, read fluently in Noongar, despite all of my best efforts, and which doesn't mean I don't try to learn as much about the language as I can. But that means that close reading is not going to be something that I go to. And I think about something like what you said about Tanya, about like theoretical texts. It's like in our field, I read and deploy and use Foucault and Marx and, continental theory all the time. And I don't read those languages fluently, and I don't read those texts in their original languages. But I can use their ideas and relate to them in different kinds of ways and in responsible ways. But I'm not close reading those texts in the same kinds of ways. So how do I engage literary analyses, engage translation studies, and admit my own limits and humility in terms of the claims I'm making, and then still produce arguments and engage with these traditions, rather than just say, I don't know the language, I can't, let me just go back to what's familiar, which I think is sometimes a move of a lot of people that can become an ability of a strategy of avoidance, if not kind of consciously so, implicitly. So, and I'll end there. And again, I don't think they can get enough thanks, but David, Michael, and Lara, this has just been so wonderful and so amazing over the last couple days. And I'll turn it over to you for the closing remarks.
Thank you so much, Ryan and Tanya and Jason and Fariha and Manu, for such a rich closing panel. I just want to sort of pick up on, I suppose, I'm going to do a sort of Raymond Williams keywords out of your discussion. Disidentification, which is such an interesting thing, because I do share Tanya's sense of disidentification with my job title, which is Lecturer in Victorian Studies, for a lot of reasons. And we have to be aware of that, the genealogy of that term as well. This kind of queer studies, origin of it in a way, which, are we queer 19th centuryists in any way? And then the second word is post-colonial studies. There's the LARP piece talks about how Victorian studies has failed to really integrate post-colonial studies and the insights from post-colonial studies into our analyses of empire. Yes, in some ways. No, in some ways. Is it still important that we do so? Or is it redundant now? Is that kind of has that deconstructionist critique that characterizes post-colonial studies had its moment? The second is historicity. It's really, really, really interesting, because obviously historicity is loaded with Western epistemologies and temporalities. But also Jason spoke in some very specific ways about the importance of historicity and locatedness when it comes to thinking about genres and the different ways in which genres are reconfigured and reassembled in different geographical contexts. And I can't wait to read you and Tanya's new project, because I'm just starting a project on periodical poetry that's kind of cross-comparative, newspaper poetry that's kind of cross-comparative. And one of the things I'm really interested in is the way different Indigenous language texts kind of move across different zones and are transliterated, and how we handle that as scholars. So I can't wait for your work. Yeah, and then the politics of citation, this whole thing about the politics of citation, how it relates to the structures of racial and gender exclusion within our own academic context, and how it relates to our own positionality as academics within the Western or Euro-American academy, and what other forms of knowledge and fields we need to engage with to do decolonial studies. I like 19th century studies. I'm done with Victorian, but yeah, 19th century studies, I'd love to see that as the new category that emerges. But do Victorian and Romanticism still have their place? I think Manu and Fariha and you all made really, really compelling cases, and Ryan as well, really compelling cases for why Victorian and Romanticism still matter as categories and still important as categories, and can be mobilized in decolonial methods. So thank you for that. Finally, the final two topics, language and languages. I mean, I've been trying to learn not even a non-European language, Dutch, for the last year, just to kind of read South African periodicals. I'm still struggling with basic literacy. And that's before I get to any of the Indigenous languages that I will need to kind of handle in the periodicals I work with. Language is a real problem. And that kind of links to Tanya's point about collaboration as method and the importance of that, but also the limitations of doing that. You know, if you're a scholar, especially an early career scholar, working on your own without access to research assistants or large pots of funding, how do you do that? Yet we need, you know, we can start by creating moments like this where we collaborate and learn from each other. That's always been my starting point, having started a project where I tried to do some of these things as a then unfunded PhD scholar. So yeah, collaboration is method, the importance of collaboration. And I want to begin by thanking everyone who's spoken, everyone who's contributed, everyone who's listened, and everyone who's contributed papers, thoughts, questions, and resources to this last 2 days. It's been such an incredibly enriching and reinvigorating. I mean, 2020 has totally blown, but this has been such a reinvigorating session. Please do continue these conversations in Slack. Please do continue to add resources, and please do also, yeah, we'd like to pick, I'd like this to have an afterlife in that form as a starting point. I'd also like it to have an we also aim to, for this conference, to have an afterlife in various other forms. One of the things we'd love anyone who feels like it to do is to contribute a blog post to the Centre for Indigenous and Settler Colonial Studies blog. This can be a blog post about your research, about your methodological problems, or we've had some wonderful papers from Alice and from Robert and Chiara that amplify particular Indigenous activist struggles, and we'd love to use our networks and our platform to amplify those. So if Robert or Chiara or Alice would like to speak to any of those Indigenous activist struggles in their particular concepts and write a blog on that, you know, we'd love to disseminate that far and wide. And then we're hoping to hold another workshop online, but a work in progress workshop. So where we get together and we bring a piece of unfinished or work in progress work and we think about it together. So really kind of trying to put that idea of collaboration as methods into practice amongst our own community. So those are two things immediately that we want to do, and we invite your participation in as we move forward from this conference. I've got some questions in the chat about recordings. This whole session's been recorded. Michael, who's been our technical whiz, I mean, the fact that the technology's worked is entirely down to Michael and absolutely nothing to do with me, is going to put these on the YouTube channel, which we'll link to on the conference website, and that will happen in due course. I'd like to say a massive thank you to everyone who's been involved in the organisation of this project. Portia and the Fermanis and the Southend team have been so instrumental in this. You know, my real conversations about method began when I was a postdoctoral researcher there. When we thought we were going to have this conference in person in Kent, Portia immediately offered the support of their, you know, of not just their scholarly contributions, but also financial contribution. So massive thank you to Portia and to Sarah and to Megan for your organisational input and for your fantastic presentations. Also a huge thank you to David, to Holly, to Dan and to Charlotte in particular from the Centre for Indigenous and Settler Colonial Studies here at Kent for your organisational input, for that wonderful Indigenous Futurisms film night last night, which really just opened up new genres of film to me that I'd never been aware of. So thank you so much for that and for being involved and for contributing to this conference. Huge thank yous to Michael for the technical input, for the organisational zeal, and also for, you know, kicking my ass to get this together. We started off talking about this, you know, over coffee and prep back when that was a normal thing. And yeah, so thank you, Michael, for providing the animus and the energy to sort of keep this, the idea of doing this alive through the various challenges of what has been an interesting year in all sorts of ways. I think that's pretty much the end of what I wanted to say. Thank you so much. We will be in touch, and please stay in touch with us and let's keep these conversations going.
Great, thank you for that, Lara. I'll just call up David
who wants to say something?
Yeah, like really brief. So I've been thanked by lots of people this last couple of days, and it's been very nice to be thanked. But actually, all of the credit goes to Lara and Michael. This was their brainchild, and they have done all of the organising. So I want to say a huge thank you on behalf of the conference and on behalf of the centre for that. When I asked colleagues whether anyone had any events in mind that might be a good launch for the centre, they proposed this, and it sounded like a good idea, and boy am I glad we went for it, because it's been a really fascinating couple of days. Thank you to all speakers, thank you to everybody who's asked questions. It's been hugely invigorating and illuminating, and just thank you, Lara and Michael, for all of your hard work.
Well, I guess it's my turn now, unless Lara, you remember something in the few seconds before I close the Zoom room forever and this goes into the oblivion of YouTube. I just guess the only person who Lara missed out to thank is herself. It's been a great pleasure to start this scholarly partnership with Lara. As you've probably all noticed over the last 2 days, if I bring the software, she's the one who brings the intellect. And it's a great pleasure to break the ship of my naivety on the iceberg of her methodology. So it's a real pleasure to work with Lara, and I've got to thank her for, it was really Lara who framed the conference. She was behind the CFP, and it was she who really came up with the ideas for the keystone events of the 2 days. So thank you so much, Lara, and thank you everybody else. So yeah, you'll be hearing from us on the Slack, on the YouTube, on the blog, on the Twitter, and I'm sure on a personal level via email and so on. So it's been a great pleasure to host you in Canterbury, and we'll see you all soon.